So as we reflect on Good Friday, the day that marks the death of Jesus, when Judas the betrayer had done his work, the others of betrayal had done their fearful flight from the garden. Peter had denied Jesus his 3 times at dawn. Christ had been beaten, crucified. He had spoken his words to the thief, his words to his mother and to John, and ultimately his words that are yet to come. It is finished. And Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And with these last words, all of creation trembled. Earthquakes, darkness, splitting rocks, opening tombs, curtains tearing. And then silence. The heavens are shut. God does not speak. In fact, all 4 Gospels fall silent at this point. And the only explanation we're given for when faith makes no sense is in John 20:19 and in Luke 24:21. And so I want to look at the silence of God, what it meant for the disciples then, for the disciples today, and a little bit of what that implies. The 2 places we understand and can extract meaning for the silence that followed that day was what we see on the road to Emmaus, and we'll come back to this text after Easter. The disciples are walking on the road, and they encounter a stranger, on the road. And he asks them, "What are you guys talking about?" And they say to him, "What, do you not know what happened? Are you that clueless?" And they start to tell him the story, and they said, and we had hoped he was the Messiah who was to come to rescue Israel. And this all happened 3 days ago. And the other clue we get is in John 20. That Sunday evening, referring to after Jesus was raised, that Sunday evening the disciples were meeting behind locked doors because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders. And then Jesus shows up. And so for the disciples then, there is this place of fear and confusion and struggle that was so potent that even the evidence that was in front of them, the evidence of the resurrection that was right in front of their faces, was not enough to get through to them. They hid, they ran, they abandoned and separated and ditched and were running away to their hometowns and hiding in rooms, not knowing what to do. And you know what reminds me of 2 other moments. In Israel's history, Exodus 1, there was the generations of silence. They moved down to Egypt under the favor of the Pharaoh and Joseph. And then Joseph passed, and you have this jump. It jumps 400 years from, hey, things were great, and then all of a sudden, and the bad news. And then there's another period shortly after, significantly after that, after the last of the Old Testament books is written. And they call it the intertestamental period. And there's some history books that are written. But it's called the 400 years of silence, where God sent no prophet. There was no message from the Lord. That deep, soul-numbing silence. The holes in the text, and almost in a sense like the blackout curtains on the life of faith. It's all dark, and with sparse words rarely found to make sense of the dark that covers them. And God was silent. And the people who often asked, well, what are we supposed to do? Do we keep going and hoping things will get better? Do we just trust that we're in the right place with God and everything will be fine? Do we give up on God? Because it seems like He gave up on us. It has been dark and quiet, and I don't know what's going on. And it's out of these places that the disciples were emotionally and mentally in. I'm having an issue here. Can you go to the next one? And it's in these places that they were stuck. And in a sense, we are invited into those same places of not sure what God is doing. We have this idea that what life with Jesus, we have a sense of what it would look like, right? You come to faith and you start walking in faith and everything. I mean, we have dreams of health and success, freedom and goodness, intimacy with God, and this is what we hope for. And we rarely have a concept of struggle and of doubt and suffering when we come into these things. Nobody walks into marriage thinking, wow, it's going to be really, we're going to have some rough times, and we're going to really struggle through some health issues, and, we may never have kids, or if we do have kids, there might be issues with substances in our lives. Nobody thinks about these things when they're going to the altar, do they? I mean, and yet they're part of the journey. The incarnation of Jesus, from the very beginning, he told them, I'm going to die. I've come for this purpose. And yet they couldn't hear it because they were so fixated on the Messiah who had come to start his kingdom that they couldn't imagine that it would get dark. Until it hits. And then it hits. And the reality of the phrases, come home, from the disciples. We had hoped, past tense. The disciples, out of fear, we hid. And the faith and the joy and the delight that we have is almost eclipsed by the pain and the struggle that we're in. The delight of the wedding, the delight of the child being born, the delight of new faith, all of it gets eclipsed by this heaviness of pain and suffering and struggle. And so the question is, what do we do when we come to those moments? Do we look in fear and lock the door? Do we flee to home in safety, abandon what we are in the hopes that what we had before was better than this and would still be there? Do we hide from anyone and everything that might further threaten our fragile sense of stability? I think the older we get, the more we glimpse that the life of faithfulness and faith intersects with troubles and struggles. That they're not things that don't belong together. In fact, in many ways, it is the life of faith that can make sense of the dark, that can make sense of the struggles, can make sense of the disappointments and the frustrations and the hurdles that we just can't get ourselves over. There are many who, like the disciples on that long Saturday between Jesus' death and the rising day where he emerged from the tomb, when no one wrote a word, wondering, is this it? Is this the end? There are many who, like that, kind of fear to speak into the silence. And so I think the gospel writers were very intentional. They gave us that silence as a gift. They gave us the silence following Good Friday. The silence of that Saturday is a gift to us. It's a time to pause and stop and to recognize the worth of what's going on, and recognize also that there's an invitation in that silence. There's an invitation in that hollowness. Where's the silence for you in your life? Where do you feel the heavens shut and the prayers dry up? What wordless places in our hearts and what dark groaning pains do we have that it seems that God cannot or does not touch? This is what brings us into this place of what many Christians call deconstruction. We grew up with this faith, or we were told that this is what faith is. But the problem is this faith isn't working, is it? I mean, the disciples were there. They walked in faith. And then all of a sudden, like we saw in the Luke 24 passage and John 20 passage, the faith that they had clearly couldn't handle what they had just walked into, right? And I think some of us have been there, and we all know somebody that's been there, that the diagnosis of sterility or the diagnosis of cancer or the news that your friend, spouse, parent has died suddenly. My faith wasn't ready for this. I wasn't ready for this. How am I supposed to navigate this? The faith that I had that got me here isn't going to be the faith that's getting me through it and out the other end. And so we deconstruct. We start breaking things off of our faith because they can't handle the weight and the pressure of this. And as the disciples reflected on this situation, they had to contend with what they thought Jesus was doing, who they thought Jesus was, what they thought he was going to do in their lives, and square with what he was actually doing, what was actually happening, what actually went down. And so do we. So do we. We have to square with it. We have to ask the terrifying questions of what do we think God was doing here? We have to go back to him and ask him, what is God? Where is God in this? What is God doing? And I will tell you that your faith will fail you if it doesn't. If you don't, on some level, strip pieces of your faith off and get rid of it because it needs to grow up and it isn't growing, that your faith will fail you because it is based on where you were when you started it. That's why faith like a child, as great as it is not actually our model of growth. What we do, what we think, what we believe have to grow with us, have to weather the storms with us, have to change with us. And so long as we are the reference point of all these things, as long as we are the definition of what can be trusted, then our faith won't survive the rebuilding. Because if our life circles the drain, then so guess what else circles the drain? Our faith. If everything that we build starts to fall apart, then guess what else falls apart that we built? Our faith. And so I want to invite you into that space of deconstruction today. Because let me promise you this. In these moments of darkness and earthquake, in these times of grief and loss, of disappointment and ashes, trying to find the light, to peek through the curtain of those years of silence, whether it's measured in days or whether it's measured in depth, peeking through the darkness. Let me promise you this. He's up to something. And what will keep you from seeing it, just like the disciples, is where you go with your struggle. It's where you go with your wrestling in the dark, like Jacob on the banks of the Jabbok River with the angel. Where do you go in the darkness of your struggling? Into your doubt or to God with your doubt? See, the difference between deconstruction that destroys your faith and deconstruction that renews your faith, transforms your faith, is who we look to for answers when the faith that we have can't bear the weight of life. I'm a fan of philosophy. Friedrich Nietzsche said that there will always be rocks in the road ahead of us. There'll be stumbling blocks or there'll be stepping stones, and it all depends on how you use them. Now, Friedrich Nietzsche was a nihilist. He was famous for coining the phrase, God is dead. But what he was really saying is that faith is dead. Our understanding of God is dead. And I think that is a very fitting place to be. Because sometimes our understanding of God must die in order for us to perceive and recognize where God is at work. We have to let go of our expectations and our sense of what God owes us and what he's going to do for us. And we have to untether him from that sense of expectation and open ourselves to what he might do next. To look and say, God, I don't know what you're doing, because clearly if I did, I wouldn't be in this spot, this wouldn't be happening. Maybe what you're doing is something that's beyond my perception, beyond my understanding, beyond this darkness. And so I surrender it to you. Show me who you are. And so instead of quoting Nietzsche, the same idea, but I want to commend to you this idea. The same concept, just in a more God-centered way. That the rocks that threaten to crush you and trip you today are the stepping stones across the floods of tomorrow. The faith that weathers these stones now is the faith that rises above the floods and struggles of tomorrow. It creates a spiritual resiliency. And so we return to ask, what are you up to, God? What are you doing here? But probably the more important question you could probably, and most importantly, ask the person you're sitting next to, where is God in this? Genuinely, curiously, God, where are you in this? What do you want to say to me? You see, the disciples were locked in darkness and despair, in grief and loss, and they couldn't even make sense of the empty tomb that they had walked into. Don't you find that kind of astonishing? Mary got it. Mary got it right out the door because she was willing to look for a God where she didn't expect him, even though she mistook him for a gardener, but that's another story. She was willing to look for the God of the unexpected. And how embarrassing that the boys that walked with him for years didn't get it, but Mary did, instantly. But they didn't get it. They walked in the tomb, they saw the bundled clothes, and it didn't penetrate. They went back and hid in the room again. There was no joy because their vision was still so locked on the Christ that they expected in the tomb that they didn't know how to make sense of what God has done. Have you ever been there? Wondering, God, I can't make sense of what you're doing here. You're doing something. I just can't make sense of this. What is going on here in my life? And as the fractures in the darkness begin, the core of this is that what we learn from Mary that the disciples did not carry. And how fitting, because at the time, way back then, women weren't really considered people. They weren't honored, they weren't respected or valued. Their testimony wasn't even considered legal. If a woman said something, it had zero legal weight unless 3 women testified the same thing, and then it would be only worth one man's voice. Like the inherent sexism and oppression is embarrassing. But she got it because she was looking for Jesus, not for the tomb. She wasn't looking for the body, she was looking for the Christ. She was open, she was searching. And that's what it takes for us. We have to turn our eyes to look for Jesus, to search for where he is at, to search for what he is doing. Christ, where are you in this? Where are you in these rocks so that I can see you when the floods come? And so on the road to Emmaus, the answer is that it took an appearing of Christ and our vision set on Christ to see him and what he is doing, to recognize who he is. On the road to Emmaus, the stranger on the road said, wasn't it predicted that the Messiah would have to suffer all these terrible things before he entered his glory? He's trying to help them pierce the darkness. And then Jesus took them through the writings of Moses and all the prophets, which basically means the Old Testament, explaining from the scriptures the things concerning himself. And by the time they were nearing Emmaus and the journey was to end, Jesus acted like he was going to carry on walking, but they begged him, no, stay the night with us. It's getting late. So he went into the house with them. He went with them. And they sat down to eat. He took the bread and blessed it, and he broke it, and he gave it to them. And suddenly, their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. And at that moment, he disappeared. See, Jesus appeared, but it wasn't because he walked on the road with them and explained the scriptures to them that they understood who it was. Although later we learned that they said, were not our hearts on fire within us? Right? They said to each other, didn't our hearts burn within us as he talked on the road and explained the scriptures to us? That the appearing of Jesus, hearing the voice of Christ, helps us pierce the darkness, pierce through the struggle and the confusion. But it isn't until we see Jesus, it isn't until we encounter the character and the love of Christ in the fellowship, in the closeness, that sense of intimacy of breaking bread, that makes sense. That the things he says come home. Jesus Christ can speak truth all we like. Our friends can speak truth to our pain all they like. But until they sit and break bread with us, it won't sink in. The Jews have this tradition that when someone dies, you just go and sit with them for days. The Jewish word for it escapes me at the moment, but it means presence. To sit and just to be present. Not to try to teach or correct, like Job's wonderful friends, but to sit with them in their pain, to share, to break bread with them, to be close. And overwhelmingly, the message we get out of the incarnation, Philippians 2, is that God has come near to break bread with us, to be close to us in our dark. The light of the world has shone in the darkness, and the darkness could not get it. It couldn't understand it. It couldn't extinguish it, encompass it. It couldn't make sense of it. And so Jesus appeared. And so it's the same with the disciples. That Sunday evening when the disciples had gathered, they were behind locked doors, and the doors were locked, and they were afraid. They were afraid. Their eyes were on what? On what was going wrong, on what they thought was going to happen, on what they expected, on what they were afraid of. And so long as our vision is set on things that we're terrified of and what we're not getting, we're never going to see the Christ. And Jesus suddenly appeared among them. Because remember, this is after they saw the empty tomb. This is after Mary told them Jesus was raised. And they're still afraid because their eyes are not on Jesus. And so suddenly Jesus was there and he said, "Peace be with you." And as he spoke, he showed them his wounds in his hands and in his side. Because now their eyes weren't on their fear. Their eyes were on the Christ. And their eyes were filled with joy when they saw the Lord. So what do you need in Jesus' appearing in your life? Where in your life are you beholding Jesus? Are you seeing the Christ? Where do you get the sense that he's breaking bread with you? And if you aren't, if you haven't come to the table, if you haven't broken bread with the risen Christ, if you haven't come and seen the marks, we're going to be talking a bit about what it means to be a Christ-centered community after Easter. Come to the table with Christ to see that. To touch and see, to hear and understand, and to behold as many did. Because here's the thing, deconstruction can only give life. Deconstruction can only give life if we go back and set our vision on Christ. Because then we can allow these things that are not of him in our faith that we thought were to fall away and be replaced with a clearer, more fuller understanding of his love, of his intimacy, of his beautiful purpose that meets us in every place, not just the comfortable, wonderful, joyous places. And so as I close the teaching today, we reflect on what it means for it to be Good Friday, the day that Jesus died. A somber moment. My friend David Fitch tweeted this just before the service started, so I'm quoting him. He says, "The day that Jesus died, a somber moment. We face the horror of violence, death, and evil that has enveloped the world, all taken in by God in the flesh on a cross. And in this, and through this alone, the Son makes space for us to live in his victory." That's what makes Good Friday good. Not that Jesus died, but that Jesus had a deep and profound purpose through this darkness of his death. And so as I close the teaching time here, we move into this mindset and the space of communion about where God has created space for us to come to the table to sit with him, to share with him. You know, the Last Supper, Jesus was sitting at the table. It says John the Beloved had sat, the disciple whom Jesus loved, John, was sitting at the table with him when he said these things. And the Greek word there is sunanakaimai. I know I'm nerdy, so it's okay, just bear with me for a minute. It means to sit at the table with, but it has a totally different image. It's the image of reclining, but not together. Kind of like leaning into each other. So Jesus was at this low table with cushions, and he was leaning with the disciples. And as you're eating dinner, you could actually, your ear would almost rest on his chest. You could hear his heart beating. You could hear the heartbeat of God as he says to you, I no longer call you servants, but I call you my friends. Beloved, love one another as I have loved you. The heart that was beating that moment, by that same time the next day, would not be beating again. Mark chapter 2 says the same thing. The Pharisees were all mad at Jesus. They're like, we can't believe this guy. He soon anakaimais. He sits at the table with sinners and tax collectors. Communion in that sense is the same thing. It's an invitation to sit at the table with the Christ, to hear his heartbeat in the depths of wherever we are, in the darkness and in the doubt, in the struggling, in the lack of faith, in the uncertainty, and in the joy and the confidence. Whether you're a John the Beloved, or whether you're a tax collector and a sinner, the table is open to you if you're willing to sit and hear the heartbeat of God. Come and lean against him. Because here's the problem, though, and I got to warn you. Zacchaeus did that. What happened to him? He leaned in, rejected by everyone, and he leans in and hears the heartbeat of God. And it changes him. Changes what he does, changes how he does. He says, listen, I'm not going to do this anymore. Whatever I've done, I got to fix it. And so as we come to the heartbeat, as we come to the table, come with the expectation that you will leave changed, that you will leave challenged, that you will leave loved, not as an obligation to do right, but as a privilege to do right, as a privilege to be made whole, to live in the presence of the heart that beats and stops beating for you. Because he made room for us at the table and at the cross, to carry our own cross and to see our own resurrection in his. So I invite the elders to come up and distribute the elements for communion. And I'll read to you out of 1 Corinthians chapter 11, because I think it's a good capture of what Jesus was talking about in that space of silence, in that place of darkness. As he sat at the table that last time and he shared communion with them, he said to them in a very real way that this is not just a snack, this isn't just a meal, this is my invitation to you to do life with me. And this is an invitation for the coming life that I offer to be part of you as well. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Verses 23 to 26. For I received from the Lord what I passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night that he was betrayed, he took the bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, this is my body, which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And like the Emmaus Road encounter where he broke the bread, they knew him in the breaking. May we know Christ in the breaking of bread. And in the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, this is the cup of the new covenant in my blood. Do this in remembrance of me whenever you drink it. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim Christ's life? No. You proclaim the Lord's death. We proclaim his incarnation, the fact that he came and emptied himself to come and live with us and die to be joined with us in death until he comes. because the beauty of it is that the death does not have the final word. And so we can say it is a Good Friday, just like we can say that there is good to be found in the darkness. So as we gather for communion, we take the cup. I don't have one. I need to grab one. Nope. Okay. I'll do it without it. Does everyone have the communion already? Thank you, Vivian. Our children's director, everyone. So as a community, as we gather and we take the cup, we are reminded that we get the privilege of having Christ's body broken for us. Take with me. And with that dryness in your mouth from eating that bread, let it remind you of the body that was broken, the dryness of death, and the shedding of blood for forgiveness, the blood of Christ. And with that flavor still on your mouth, I invite you into a little bit of a time of silence. Let's all close our eyes and reflect inwardly just for a few minutes, and then I'll end in prayer. But in this moment of silence, I want to invite you to turn back to God and say, God, what of my faith in you do I need to surrender so that I can see you afresh? God, where are you in this? And what are you trying to say to me? Because just like your death, this may not be good, but maybe you are good enough in this for me. So I invite you to kind of reflect on what God is wanting to say to you this Good Friday and Easter weekend. And I'll close in prayer as we reflect. Join me in silence. Oh God, thank you that you invite me to sit at the table with you, to hear your heartbeat, to set my sight on you and my vision on where you are at work. May it give me the strength, may communion give me the strength to say, you are good, and your love endures. That you have done great things, and that despite my darkness, you're not finished yet. Today is a good day because I'm ready to admit that my faith, which may not be able to hold me, falls before the one who holds me and my faith, you. I look forward to the coming day when you rise victorious as King over my darkness, over my struggle, King over all of the silence that can never have power over you. In Jesus' name, amen.